Hello, BookTube. I'm here to talk about the 10 most influential people in science fiction. It's not my list. It's a list that was created by Robert Sabella in an article he entitled Who Influenced Science Fiction that was published in summer 1984 in the magazine Thrust Science Fiction and Review. Thrust was an interesting magazine. It first started in 1973 as a fanzine, but in 1978 it became a semi-professional magazine, as you see here, and it ended in 1991. So it had a long run, but it is as short as it is. It's only like 40 pages, anywhere from 30 to 40 pages. It's packed full of goodness. It has a lot of articles from professional science fiction writers, interviews galore, Piers Anthony, Greg Bear, Gregory Benford, Larry Niven, Hal Clement, you name it. And I have 15 issues, and there's got to be dozens more, oodles more of great interviews spaced throughout this magazine. Now, it also had a really good book review and letters column, which is quite interesting because it would have letters from science fiction writers, and I noticed at least one by Robert Silverberg and other writers. So that's kind of cool. But now let's get to Robert Sabella and his list, his top 10 list. Now, he says the inspiration for this came from a book called The 100, a ranking of the most influential persons in history by Michael H. Hart, published in 1978. Now, Sabella was born in 1948, died in 2001. Predominantly, as far as I could tell, was a mathematics teacher, and he was an editor and writer for fanzines, and he edited his own called Visions of Paradise for 40 years, with over 170 plus issues, right up until his death. Basically, it was a perzine, personal zine. Now, in 2000, he published, just before his death, a book called Who Shaped Science Fiction, which is 100 small biographies of people who've influenced science fiction. So clearly, it was based on this article, which was inspired by that other book that I mentioned. Now, he says that, his list in this article is going to be prejudicial, it's going to be biased, but he indulges the reader to listen to what he has to say and, address what he says and why if they disagree with it, or create their own list. He's interested to hear that as well. Now, he starts out he goes from 1 to 10 rather than 10 to 1. Now, everything that I'm going to say about each person on here is what he's saying more or less in the article. He starts out with John W. Campbell as number 1. As he says, he influenced science fiction in many ways, and he was the first modern writer to turn away from what he calls the slam bang space opera and demand writing that had more contemplation for human societies. And in Astounding, which he took over as editorship, he lifted science fiction writing from the purely pulp style of writing to a more serious style of writing. He encouraged and developed writers, old and new, throughout his reign as editor at Astounding, and it ushered in the golden age of science fiction. Now, he sort of feels that without John W. Campbell at the helm of Astounding, science fiction, and especially Astounding, may have floundered in the post-war pulp slump that destroyed a lot of the pulp industry for magazines. And without his sort of, making it a little more, not highbrow yet, but a little more respectable, and allowing other magazines to then flourish after. He figures that science fiction might have really, really had some dark periods during that time. Now, number 2, he goes, he puts Hugo Gernsback as number 2, and he says that he's the most influential next to John W. Campbell. Now, Up until the time Hugo Gernsback published Amazing Stories, a dedicated magazine to science fiction, science fiction was scattered throughout the pulps and some slicks. So Hugo Gernsback had a vision for what he thought science fiction was and gave it a home, a dedicated magazine. His view, which he called, but it was he was more interested in the science content rather than writing style. So it went backwards a little bit in quality of writing when he began his magazine, but it became popular and it created a fan base devoted to science fiction. Other publishers saw that there was money in them pulps, so they started doing more and publishing more science fiction magazines. And hence, without Hugo Gernsback, Sabella feels that chances are it wouldn't have been ripe for John W. Campbell to take over Astounding in the late 30s and then pull it out of the pulps, because there wouldn't have been pulps. There wouldn't have been a dedicated science fiction magazines. Now, number three is, well, he says this is a controversial or potentially controversial, and he says time may prove him wrong, and it's George Lucas. Now, he says that it's because Star Wars was such a huge hit that it brought in a lot more science fiction fans. It popularized science fiction more than it had ever been. And it allowed, like, he looks at the number of books published prior to Star Wars and after, and it skyrockets. And books begin to show up on the bestseller list. So he thinks that is the influence of Star Wars. Also, for movies, again, like publishers saw gold in pulps, studios saw gold in science fiction for movies, for TV, and there was a lot of, you could say bad science fiction after, but a lot of science fiction was being done as an influence from Star Wars. Now, it also was, Star Wars was basically a direct descendant from the pulps as well. We'll get to a little more of that later. Now, number four, he has H.G. Wells. And he says H.G. Wells is the most influential science fiction writer ever. He had popularity and critical success. Now, he quotes George Orwell here, but it's from a book that called Alternate Worlds, that an illustrated history of science fiction by John Gunn. And George Orwell said, "I doubt whether anyone who was writing books between 1900 and 1920 and wasn't influenced, it influenced the young so much. The minds of all of us would be perceptibly different if Wells never existed." So that's another basis for him to think that Wells was very important, because if Wells wasn't there to make things more popular as well at the time, and a little more respected critically, then it allowed more writing in the pulps, and then allowed Hugo Gernsback to create Amazing Stories, dedicated magazine, and then from that, John W. Campbell. You see the progression that Sabella is making here. So number five, though, rather than one person, he's got three here, but it's Donald Wollheim and Ian and Betty Ballantyne. Now, he says with the collapse of the pulps, basically in the, there was the pulps that were disappearing in post-World War II, but also magazines were disappearing in the early 50s and mid-50s. Now, he's saying that SF needed an outlet, and book publication was that. And he notes that prior to that, in the 40s, Groff Conklin and Raymond Healy and James Francis McComas published very, very popular and sold oodles, let's put it that way, copies of anthologies of science fiction. And also Donald Wollheim, he doesn't mention, but Donald Wollheim did as well. But Donald Wollheim was editor for Ace Books, and Ace published, well, it was, their aim was to provide cheap literature and cheap paperbacks. Now, Ballantine Books, founded by Ian and Betty Ballantine, took a little different approach to it. Theirs was a little more upmarket. The prices were higher. They developed new writers, as well as bringing other good old classic writers into print again. And so each had a different aim, but they both really influenced the role of or how science fiction was viewed, because they, between these two publishers, they basically, according to Sabella, created a science fiction book buying audience. Now, number six, he says, is E. Doc Smith, and he quotes John W. Campbell from a convention. He says he, meaning E. Doc Smith, made the last big breakthrough in science fiction. We're still waiting for someone else to make another. Now, he influenced dozens of writers while he was writing in the late 20s with his space operas and later. And the influence is still there today. Star Wars is a direct descendant of E. Doc Smith's space opera. And without that, would Star Wars have been made? Well, that's a question. And there's still influences of E. Doc Smith. Number 7, he says, is Robert Heinlein, and he says, other than H.G. Wells, he's the most influential writer of for science fiction. Now, he says that he had futuristic settings that were realistic, and this influenced dozens of writers, or most writers, after him. And he says he was the first science fiction writer to consider everyday lives of his characters. And he said, like he says, they both made him the most influential writer since H.G. Wells. And he also moved from the pulps into slicks, which was rare for science fiction writers, and also to escape John W. Campbell's grip on him. And another writer that did that was Ray Bradbury. And number 8, again, is 3. Anthony Boucher, J. Francis McComas, and H.L. Gold. Anthony Boucher and J. Francis McComas were editors. They started Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. And these were major developments. Them and Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and H.L. Gold's Galaxy. It was a major development during the 1950s. Now, the magazine of S and SF basically stressed literary style and characterization. Galaxy took a little bit of a different tack by saying they was more concerned for the common man and had a satirical view of the future. Now, this was kind of it was helpful in a development out of John W. Campbell's era, but also it allowed writers to expand. Where John W. Campbell had a box, and he didn't like anybody writing outside that box. The Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction and Galaxy were the place for those, which then helped develop other movements in the future. Number 9 he's got is Jules Verne. Now, Jules Verne, he says, created an SF audience with his scientific romances, and they were prime for reading H.G. Wells, and which was a more sophisticated science fiction. And without Verne, he feels that Wells may not have had such an impact, and therefore the impact from Wells to the pulps, the science fiction, to Gunsberg, and yeah, the progression goes on. And number 10, he says, is Edgar Rice Burroughs. He says not so much influence directly on science fiction. So but it's that because he was hugely popular in the pulps, he was a huge seller. He garnered a huge audience, and yeah, so he helped make science fiction sort of profitable in many ways. So that's 10. Now he goes on to say he does have an honorary list of a few other people, but he says the list could go on. But he does say other editors and critics such as Groff Conklin, Frederick Pohl, Damon Knight, Edward R. Furman, and James Blish. Writers such as Stanley Weinbaum, Isaac Asimov, Theodore Sturgeon, Ray Bradbury, Philip Jose Farmer, Fritz Leiber, Arthur C. Clarke, Roger Zelazny, Harlan Ellison, and Ursula K. Le Guin, and producers for films, George Pal, Stanley Kubrick, and Gene Roddenberry. Now, I have a few quibbles with this, but I do like his list. I do like his list a lot. Now, I quibble. I would always quibble that George Lucas is on there in Star Wars, but I can't deny the influence that has had, the good and the bad. It may have taken back science fiction 50 years, and from all the work that was done in between, tried to wash it away. Maybe not tried, but helped wash it away a little bit. So a lot of other schlocky science fiction came out after that. But it also, as he says, it prompted publishers and producers to produce films because they saw money in it. And it allowed books like A God Emperor Dune by Frank Herbert to become a bestseller on the bestseller list. That probably wouldn't have happened a decade before, or even 5 or 6 years before. So I do have to acknowledge that. Now, the one thing he mentions is that the books propped up the magazines falling out of favor and disappearing because there was an outlet. Well, that's a bit controversial, I think, because it could have been the book publishing was one of the things that was the downfall for magazines in the early 50s, the 54, 55, and then later in the late 50s, where a lot of magazines folded because writers could get more money from book publishers. So there was a more lucrative outlet. So I think there's arguments for both sides there, but it all happened at the right time for it as well. Now, I agree with John W. Campbell for all the reasons that he says pretty well. Hugo Gernsback as well, even though he has become very, very controversial today, saying that he really didn't do much. But the fact is, he was the one that created Amazing Stories, a dedicated magazine. H.G. Wells, I have no problem with that. Yeah, Donald Wollheim, Ian and Betty Ballantyne, E. Doc Smith, definitely. Yeah, I agree with all these. I'm a little confused about the Edgar Rice Burroughs one, where he says that he puts him on there as 10, but he really didn't have a huge influence on science fiction, so I'm wondering why it's on the list. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed the article and pondering what Robert Cibola had to say about this. And I'm really looking forward to eventually getting his book and reading it, his 100 people who influence science fiction. Now, do you have your own list? Do you agree with what's been said here? If you're a booktuber, if you want to make a video, please do make your own 10 top people who influence science fiction. Or in the comments, say what you think. Thank you, BookTube.